Hello, good evening. You're watching Scotland at 7 on today, a tumultuous day down in Westminster. We're going to be looking today at the top story, which is the continuing political crisis in number 10 Downing Street. And I'm going to be discussing that in a few minutes with the Member of Parliament for Gordon, who's Richard Thomson. Let's just check Richard can hear and see us okay. Good evening, Richard. How are you?
Good evening.
Right, thanks for joining us tonight. So you're still in London at the moment, where you've had a busy day, I gather.
It's been quite the day down here, but I'm sure we'll get on to cover that in some depth later on.
We will be looking at certain aspects of today's event. So just in a couple of minutes now, I'm going to begin, as usual, with today's update on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which today brings us to day 134. Some of the news today. From a couple of sources, we hear that Russia seems to be pausing to prepare for further attacks. The Washington-based research group, the Institute for the Study of War, said today that Russian forces have not claimed any territorial gains today, and that's the first time that's happened after 130 days of war. However, they don't think this is any kind of ceasefire, as the Russians are simply rebuilding their combat power for more ambitious assaults later. But meanwhile, the shelling continues. There's been many outbreaks of shelling in Ukraine's east, where at least 9 civilians have been killed and 6 wounded in the last 24 hours, according to Ukraine officials. In its morning update today, Ukraine's presidential office said that cities and villages in 7 Ukrainian regions were shelled in the past day. Most civilian deaths occurred in the Donetsk province, where fighting continues. 7 civilians were killed there, including a child, according to the office of the president. And now a missile strike on Kramatorsk. Ukraine's governor of Donetsk Oblast, Pavlo Kirilenko, today claimed that for sure at least 1's dead and 6 wounded following a Russian missile strike at the centre of that city. Mr. Kirilenko said this was a deliberate attack on civilians. Russia frequently denies targeting civilian areas, and these claims today have not been verified. And now on to the grain shipments, which are delayed in Black Sea ports. There was a ship today was tracked, or last night was tracked using shipping tracking data. It became apparent that a Russian ship, the Zibek Zoli, left the Turkish port of Karasu late on Wednesday night. This is despite Turkey's undertaking to prevent such sailings, and they said on the other day that they would actually withhold the ship and arrest it. Ukraine claims to have criminal evidence that the goods on board, the grain on board, is in fact stolen, and therefore asked the Russian authorities to impound the ship. However, it did actually sail last night. Ukraine's ambassador to Turkey did say on Sunday that the authorities had detained the ship. However, today the Ukrainian government has asked the Turkish ambassador for an explanation. Snake Island in the Black Sea, back but under attack. Ukrainian troops today raised their country's flag on the recaptured Snake Island in the Black Sea, but were later on hit by aerial bombardment from Russia, which claims to have killed an unspecified number of Ukrainian soldiers. Last story in today's Ukraine update. Ukrainian drivers will have quick access to EU roads. To make things easier for newly arrived refugees from Ukraine, today the European Union Council and Parliament announced urgent procedures to reduce the paperwork usually needed for third country citizens to drive in the EU. A spokesman said, "We want to unify and simplify the recognition of driving documents in the member states for Ukrainian refugees. Hopefully this will make their daily lives a bit easier until this unacceptable war is finally over." And that was Jaroslav Jajic, who is the Czech permanent ambassador to the European Union. So, Richard, we're going to move straight on to the top story today, which is that Boris Johnson today sort of announced his resignation, or did he? Maybe you can give me some more clarification on that later on. So the story, of course, just to update everyone, is that Boris Johnson has made a speech saying that he was going to stand down as Conservative leader. I'm not going to use the word resign, because I don't think that text appeared in his speech. But he said that he intends to stand down eventually, but will stay on until the autumn, when the Conservative Party has its chance to appoint a new leader and announce that person in their October conference. So that would normally require a caretaker Prime Minister, so Boris Johnson intends to be his own caretaker Prime Minister until the autumn. As Boris Johnson emerged from Downing Street today at 12:30 to cheers from loyal supporters, MPs, staff and his wife, but with any sign of support from allies arranged around him for his resignation speech soon drowned out by loud boos from beyond the gates at his Downing Street office. After he started speaking, the protester Steve Bray turned up his sound system to start playing Bye Bye Boris to the tune of a well-known Bay City Rollers hit. Other demonstrators booed and jeered, making it difficult for those opposite the black door of number 10 to hear Mr Johnson's words. The contrasting receptions typified much of Johnson's divisive tenure as Prime Minister, which started off with the biggest Conservative vote share since 1979, but soon became mired in scandal. In his party, as well as on the street, the growing clamour for him to step down eclipsed the encouragement for those who stuck with him until the end, and was finally too noisy for him to ignore. The speech, however, offered no apology or contrition. I'll just finish on this point for now, Richard. Mr Johnson said, "I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we are delivering so much, when we have such a vast mandate." Business said, "I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself." Okay, let me just take that point up. First of all, Richard Thomson, what would you point to as the Prime Minister Johnson's biggest successes?
Oh, goodness, that's a tough one. I don't know. I mean, I've done a series of broadcast interviews across the course of today on radio and television, and the one thing that they've put, basically everybody has put to me, whether it's been BBC TV or the radio, is that Boris Johnson has been such a recruiting sergeant for Scottish independence and the SNP. What are you going to do without him? Now, my response to that has been to say that, well, he's certainly crystallised a lot of people's feelings about how they consider Westminster mismanages Scottish affairs, and showed just what can happen when you don't have people who respect the norms of democracy in power. That sometimes the damage to the common good is such that you just have to set any other partisan considerations aside and get short of the individual and move on and allow politics to progress. So I think his achievement is certainly not getting Brexit done, as he would put it, but I think from a Scottish nationalist perspective, his achievement is, I think he's brought into very, very sharp focus the importance of achieving our independence as soon as we lawfully, legally and constitutionally can do so.
Lovely, of course, yes. And we will move on to that in the next story, because we'll look at Nicola Sturgeon's response to Mr Johnson's speech. The points Mr Johnson himself would make, of course, would be that, as you said, Brexit, it's far from done, but nonetheless, that's what he claims was his big success. And the other huge success was the rollout of COVID vaccines. But I think that's happened in other countries too, hasn't it? He keeps using the phrase of the fastest vaccine rollout. Is that entirely
I mean, they were
fair?
fast out of the blocks, but other countries managed to catch up because of procurement issues in the UK. So it evened itself out, and eventually the UK was left behind, and of course had one of the highest death rates of any of the advanced economies. So I think that anyone that goes through that and examines the data would struggle to support his conclusion. He always used to claim at Prime Minister's questions it was the fastest growing economy in the G7 in the UK. It wasn't. The UK fell the furthest, and it had the furthest to bounce back, but you can see how sclerotic things are with the headwinds of Brexit that we've got to contend with. And of course, if we've got Brexit done, it begs the question about why we keep having to return to get it done even more. I mean, I'm the SNP spokesperson in Northern Ireland. We've been going through the rigmarole of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. That's about to come back, we think. Well, we're not terribly sure, because for a time today, there wasn't a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland at all. But if Brexit is done, why do we keep having to come back to get it done again? It just shows the lie that is at the back of it. And of course, if we were used to in the 1980s, when I was growing up watching television, hearing people say, "and that's except for viewers in Scotland." I think getting Brexit done should have come with that warning at the bottom of the screen, "except for viewers in Northern Ireland," because it's incredible the way that a notional unionist Prime Minister has managed to create a border down the Irish Sea in the manner that he has.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that might well prove to be one of his achievements, of course, uniting Ireland. But again, that remains to be seen. So I'm going to go back to the story just now, because there's some more aspects of it you may wish to discuss. So Johnson has, of course, said that he wanted to persuade his colleagues to agree to him staying on till October. I don't know if it's entirely clear if he's going to get away with that. However, the story says that his premiership began with a very large Tory majority in the House of Commons, as you say, Richard, from votes in England rather than from Scotland. And in spite of that, though, he's eroded his support to disgruntled MPs in his own party, angry that he intends to stay on until a successor is selected, rather than promptly handing over to a caretaker. The lack of contrition rubbed salt into the wounds. He didn't say sorry for anything. It was a short, this is Andrew Bridgen, whom I'm sure you know down the road. It was a short and bizarre resignation speech which didn't mention the word resign or resignation once. There was no apology, no contrition. That's Andrew Bridgen, who's MP for... sorry, I can't remember who he's MP for. Sorry, I didn't look him up. So anyway, Andrew Bridgen says, there was no apology for the crisis. His actions have put our government, our democracy, through. Now, do you think, Richard, is this a crisis for democracy, for the political system? One of the key things about one of the many key pillars of democracy, is it not, is the smooth transition from one leader to the next. Is Johnson causing a blockage in the democratic process?
I think there was a real danger that he would. I mean, he was behaving almost like Donald Trump in his own way. Donald Trump, who it was, of course, who referred to Johnson as Britain Trump in a notorious tweet. But by refusing to accept that his time was up, it was just another norm that he was in danger of subverting. And there were discussions last night about what happens if he chooses not to go. And eventually, in some of the discussions I was having, we were getting to the conclusion that it might have needed a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons, and then for him, presumably then, to go to the Queen to try and dissolve Parliament, have an election, deselect his enemies, and, come back stronger, as he would see it. And it all rested on, under that scenario, the Queen telling him, no, there's a viable Parliament there, and I'm not going to grant you a dissolution. And if you can no longer command the authority of the House of Commons, by which, having sufficient Conservative MPs to back him as the largest single party, then can you tell me who you would recommend Prime Minister to who can command the authority of the House of Commons? So that would really have been the constitutional safeguard. But it would have relied on a 95-year-old woman, basically, having been suitably advised and having the strength of character to do that. And it seems to me utterly bizarre that is what we were ultimately potentially going to be relying on if he couldn't be made to face reality. I mean, last night we were looking at the resignations ticking up, and then we saw that Michael Gove had gone in to see him, and he'd handed over the pearl-handed revolver to Boris Johnson, and then, of course, Boris metaphorically at least shot Gove with it, sacking Michael Gove. Now, I've got very limited sympathy for Michael Gove under those scenarios, but it really was another level of delusion that Johnson seemed to be going through last night. So I think that's a very, so he's indicated his intent to resign as leader of the Conservative Party, and the expectation would be that when there's a new Tory leader, then they will become Prime Minister. But I think that his position is utterly untenable as Prime Minister now. He's completely ground the UK government to a halt. It's unable to transact business. It's unable to take big policy decisions, whether that's over the security situation in Europe, whether it comes to tackling the cost of living crisis. For those of us that we get our finger wagged at us patronisingly about how things are supposedly in Scotland, we had for a time today in England, they had an education department with no education ministers in it. There are 6 police forces in England that have been placed into special measures. So, you have well, the Scottish government is getting on with things. There's 2 functioning governments in the UK at the moment. One's in Edinburgh under the SNP Green Coalition, and the other one is in Cardiff. Basically, in order to restore any kind of continuity or stability, and even a modicum of credibility, Johnson has to go. and there has to be somebody taking over who can act as a caretaker, because Boris Johnson is no caretaker. And quite frankly, the sooner the Pickford's vans are reversing up Downing Street to get him and his family out of there, I think the better for everyone, because this is going to cause so much trouble behind the scenes as well. Government gets on with things as best it can, but all the stakeholders who need to engage with the UK government, what sort of meaningful engagement can you have with ministers who are basically there right now as placeholders, who can't take major policy or spending decisions, and who don't know if they're going to be there past August or September time? It's just utterly farcical. And the way that we could make it less farcical is for Johnson to get out of 10 Downing Street, and for the good of everyone, not least I suspect himself. I think that's exactly what
Yes,
we should do.
Smooth transfer of power. That's the phrase that's usually used in democracies. And in fact, Angela Rayner, Deputy Labour leader, took up that point about the dysfunctionality of the government. She said today, apparently, you probably heard her saying this, "I hate to break it to the minister," she said in the House, "but we don't have a functioning government," adding, "The chaos in the last 3 days is more than just petty Tory infighting. These actions have serious consequences for the running of the country." And she pointed to 11 parliamentary committees which were meant to meet today to scrutinise various aspects of legislation, and some of them could not meet because the relevant minister wasn't there, hadn't been appointed.
I was speaking on that statement Hugh, for the SNP shortly after Angela Rayner, and the point that I opened up with was that what had triggered this was the fact that the resignations that had happened had mostly been from the junior ranks of the government's ministers rather than from the cabinet, who had been clinging on, and that while I'd been dreaming about having a cabinet of Remainers ever since I'd been elected, it wasn't the Remainers of that type that I'd been hoping for. It's the leadership here has come from the junior ranks, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting, to put it like that, to see the people in the cabinet who kept their powder dry, who didn't say a word, who remained loyal to Boris Johnson, who enabled him, who sustained him in office, somehow saying that actually they had their concerns all along, that's not how they would do things. I think it's going to be comedy gold, frankly, when folk like Liz Truss or Ben Wallace or Priti Patel start trying to hawk themselves around for votes inside their own party.
Yeah, this, of course, is one of those occasions where, he is a lame duck Prime Minister if he does manage to struggle on to November or October, but everyone is circling to take the top job. But your view on it, Richard, is it looks very unlikely that Boris Johnson is going to be able to continue. So, but you don't think there's going to be a dissolution? There's unlikely to be a snap general election. So
I think that prospect is greatly receded. It was only ever useful as a threat to try and keep his backbenchers in line, because the backbenchers can read the opinion polls in Scotland just as well as they can in England and anywhere else, and they knew they were in for a hiding at the hands of the voters. And you saw that in the two by-elections in England, in Wakefield and Tiverton and Honiton and other ones recently. I think that's now a receding prospect. He's done, he's toast, he's going. I don't think anyone newly through the door is going to risk it. They're going to want to take some time to establish themselves as the Prime Minister and establish their team round about them. It doesn't mean that we'll run the full 4.5-year term as we expect this time. So I wouldn't rule out an election before then, but I think the prospect of an immediate general election, as in within the next few months, has receded greatly.
Right, so
my personal opinion.
Probably. But that's why you're here. So you think there probably will be a caretaker Prime Minister. After all, what is Dominic Raab for?
Well, I think there should be a caretaker Prime Minister. I'm not certain there will be. That again depends on how far the Tory MPs are prepared to push. But I think that even if it doesn't happen tonight or tomorrow, there is pressure building for that. And I think that ultimately the impossible nature of the position that they're putting themselves in by allowing Johnson to stay will overcome even the most loyal of Boris Johnson supporters, and I suspect he'll be out before the summer's out.
Another aspect of it that occurs to me, it's possible that there might be another vote of no confidence, because as you know, the Tory backbenchers are supposed to not do that within a year, but they can rewrite the rules next week. So if that happens, there have been rumours I picked up that Keir Starmer, he probably doesn't want this to be known, but he's supposed to have been talking to Ian Blackford today. There is a possible scenario, isn't there, that somebody moves a no confidence motion next week. A lot of Conservative MPs just find themselves busy and unable to attend the House that day, and Labour and SNP vote the Prime Minister down. Is that a likely scenario?
It's a possibility. I mean, I don't know what discussions have been going on at that high leadership level, but I would be surprised if discussions like that weren't taking place. But, you've got to be careful you don't push the Tories back together. We know Johnson's going, but I think the way he gets out the door fastest is it could quite easily be through a no confidence vote. But the best outcome would be for the Conservatives to move that themselves, rather than giving them any kind of flag to rally around. But let's wait and see, because that's we're into different uncharted territory here. The danger in months past was if you'd put something on motion of no confidence down, you would just unite them. But we may well just. I think we may be past that point now. But I think the pressure will build over the course of the next 24, 48, 72 hours for Johnson to accelerate his timetable for departure, and for a caretaker to take over. And we'll just have to see how that one plays out.
Yep. Okay, more aspects of that will be discussed in a couple of minutes, Richard. Let's first go into the official response to the Prime Minister's to the crisis. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has today said that it's an unsustainable proposition for Mr Johnson to act as his own interim Prime Minister. Ms Sturgeon used the opportunity to discuss Scotland's largely anti-Conservative stance and the need for a permanent alternative to Westminster, saying Scotland will replace one Prime Minister they didn't vote for another one they didn't vote for. Ms Sturgeon used the breakdown of this rotten government, as she called it, as an example of why she thought Scottish independence was a democratic cause. Commenting on Boris Johnson's expected resignation, Ian Blackford, your colleague in Westminster, said Boris Johnson's resignation is welcome, but for Scotland it changes very little. We're still controlled by a Westminster system that saw fit to make him Prime Minister. Whoever replaces him, Scotland will still be saddled with a Tory government we didn't vote for, imposing Brexit, austerity cuts, and damaging policies against Scotland's will. And with all the Westminster parties fully signed up to a hard Brexit, it's clear that a change of government alone cannot provide the real change that Scotland needs. The only way to escape the damage of Westminster control is to become an independent country, and with the full powers needed to regain our place in Europe and build a fair and prosperous future. And finally, Ian Blackford said, whoever takes over from Boris Johnson must respect the democratic mandate Scotland has to hold an independence referendum so we can escape Westminster control for good. So emphasising the aspect of democracy, we said earlier on that Johnson had a very large share of the vote when he won his 80-seat majority, but I haven't looked up the figures, Richard, but I don't think it was higher than the combined share of the vote of the SNP and the Scottish Greens. So if he had a huge, overwhelming mandate, does Scotland have a mandate to choose its own path too?
Well, I think that the comparison between the Holyrood results and the Westminster results are quite telling. That the SNP won 48% of the vote, got 49% of the seats at Holyrood, and pro-independence parties took 51% of the vote. But if you compared the result you had there with and applied it in first past the post at Westminster, the SNP would have a majority of something like about 400 or 500. I forget exactly what the story was, but over all the other parties. So it just shows the distorting nature of first past the post and the effect it has that a relatively small gap sometimes between Labour and Conservative in England can yield a large undeserved majority. And of course, I was speaking to a Labour MP the other night who's one of their key election strategists. I won't say any more in case I inadvertently identify him. And I kept putting the point to him that, look, for every 1 year in 3, Labour gets a chance to control Westminster through first past the post, but that election system puts the Tories in power 2 years out of every 3. Why don't you go for proportional representation? And he completely poo-pooed the idea. So, it just goes to show how unreformable Westminster is, even when you're suggesting modest reforms that would be to the benefit of of even the Labour Party. They would much rather lose twice as often as they win just to get their hands on the prize when they do. But fundamentally, the question of Scotland's rights to choose is a live issue. The people of Scotland are sovereign. We have expressed a view clearly. We've given multiple mandates now that the question should be put once again in terms of independence, in light of all we've experienced since the last referendum in 2014, and particularly because of the material change of circumstances that Brexit represents. Now, I'm quite clear that should go ahead, and I think Nicola Sturgeon has mapped out a very, very clear route to that. The best way, because we want to become independent, we want to be recognised internationally, the best way to that goal is for the governments in Edinburgh and London to agree on a way forward, and for both parliaments to legislate to give effect to Scotland's independence in the event of a yes vote in that referendum. That gives us the internal legitimacy in Scotland that people respect the result, and it gives us the external legitimacy that we need in Europe and the wider world to have the result recognised. So that's the best way, as we did it in 2014. The next best is, as the Scottish Government is doing, is to test the VS, the powers, if you like, of the Scottish Parliament to legislate on a consultative referendum. Now, we know all referendums are consultative, even the ones that are initiated in Westminster, that they're not self-executing, as the term goes. But basically, Parliament has to legislate in order to give effect to the outcome. So that's the basis of the contention that the Scottish Parliament has the right to, or the ability, even under the Scotland Act as written, to proceed with a referendum. So I think it's a smart move, and it certainly caught everybody on the hop to simply progress that directly to the Supreme Court, to advance to go, if you like, and to get that adjudication in place. And of course, then at that point, having exhausted all other possibilities, I think it's reasonable, if there is no other route, to go down the route of the single issue election. But I think that's pretty much where we are. And I think contrasting the careful, lawful, respectful way in which the Scottish Government has gone about setting to test how that route to independence might look. Compare and contrast that with the shenanigans we've seen at Westminster over the last few days, the repeated debasement of standards in public life and the thumbing the nose to democratic norms, the refusal to adhere to international norms and to respect international law, even treaties that were signed up to through, like the withdrawal agreement in the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think there's a tale of two governments, and the Scottish Government is emerging as the government which looks like the reliable, lawful, respectful government that is respectful of the law and the international order, whereas we have this renegade government that Boris Johnson's still determined to keep his claws in until the last possible moment. I think the contrast there couldn't be clearer, whether that's domestically in Scotland or internationally, to the growing audience that's taking interest in where Scotland is headed.
You've just kind of answered my next question for me, Richard. In the confusion in Westminster, I was about to say, surely Scotland now has the upper hand. As you said before, there's only two governments actually functioning right now in the UK, and that's in Cardiff and in Edinburgh. And surely in some way this should increase the Scottish Government's leverage to get that Section 30. I was about to ask whether what would you think? I think I know the answer now. What would you say if Scottish independent supporters started going to London and maybe standing next to Steve Bray with sound systems and started making a bit of noise in London saying, we've got to move this on, give us a Section 30. But you'd obviously prefer the more calm legal process. Well, there's nothing illegal about having a demonstration and play City Road.
Nothing. Not even Boris Johnson managed to make that illegal. But no, I mean, I don't see why. I can't remember what book it was. It might have been Andrew Marr's book years ago, The Battle for Scotland. And he quoted a Liberal MP who was arguing at the time for Home Rule and saying that just because something is asked for reasonably doesn't mean the passion there is any less deeply held, or that the opinion holds any less force. And quite frankly, I think it's demeaning that we would have to even consider a tactic like that. This is a democratic right, And, Boris Johnson rushed a letter out the door last night saying no to a Section 30 order. Well, frankly, we know he's going out the door. Who cares what Boris Johnson thinks? There's another Prime Minister coming along. In the meantime, we've got the matter lodged at the Supreme Court, and there's not a thing the UK government can do about it. So, I think that there's all sorts of things you can do to build political pressure and to build up support for things. I think I've got full confidence in the way the Scottish Government is going about this. It's going about it because we need to have, it's one thing to say you're sovereign, but we need to make sure that we've got internal legitimacy, that everybody in Scotland can respect the result, whether they wanted independence or not, whatever that result turns out to be, and that if in the event it's a yes vote for independence, that people outside Scotland can recognise that it's been done lawfully and legitimately, because that's the only way you get into the European Union. We also saw what happened in Catalonia. They had the referendum, and I'm not going to be critical of the Catalan leaders other than to say, Catalonia isn't independent. So, that's not we have to do things in the way that works for us, in the way that demonstrates to other states in the EU that we've gone about this responsibly and legally, and that the result has legitimacy and must be respected, so that you don't give anybody the option of not respecting that outcome if that's what Scotland votes for. So we absolutely have to go down that road, and I get that sometimes it's frustrating and it's not as much fun as some of the activities that we had in the referendum. But for me, it seems almost like we're in kind of 2011. We're in this kind of argument about process, where the UK government's trying to portray the Scottish government as being unreasonable, not respecting democracy. Of course, back then, the argument was about, we were somehow unreasonable for wanting the Electoral Commission to oversee it, an Electoral Commission that's now been eviscerated by the UK government. We were trying to subvert the franchise by not allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. And of course, eventually we got both the Electoral Commission oversight and those votes. So it seems to me we're stuck in that kind of argument. So we spend more, and I think we've got to be aware of this, not just in the SNP, but the wider Yes movement, that we don't get bogged down unduly in arguments about process, because nobody is, in terms of the wider public, who we need to persuade, the swing voters, the ones who will make or break any future referendum, we need to engage them in ideas about why this is going to make a difference for their lives, for their children's lives, for their grandchildren's lives. And it's those fundamental issues of principle and allowing the vision to be created about what an independent Scotland could be like. That's where this is going to be won and lost, rather than into arguments about process or getting overly impatient about the route that I would hope we can all recognise at some level needs to be taken if we're going to get to the end point of the journey that we've all been marching on for so long.
Yes, and a recent poll did, I think, say that something like 1 in 10 haven't made their mind up. 1 in 10 in Scotland can see both sides of the argument and haven't decided. But as you say, Richard, it's those 1 in 10 who will really decide it when it comes down to it. Now, better move on. Oh, sorry, just before we move on, there's one other aspect of the Johnson leadership I'd like to ask your opinion on, which is let me just put a suggestion to you. It's not my suggestion, but it's been made by President Zelensky and others. In Boris Johnson, Ukraine has its staunchest ally. Johnson is a #1 international friend of Ukraine. And 2 points on that. One is that I have read several people online today, journalists from Ukraine, saying, we're really sorry to see Johnson go. Does that mean there's going to be a change in policy? And on the other hand, you've probably read in The Guardian yourself, Russian commentators have been saying that's what happens if you mess with Russia. Johnson's finished. So it's Ukraine and his opposition to Russia that's broken him. Now, obviously, that's propaganda, right? But what about the genuine outpouring of support for Johnson in Ukraine?
Well, I can understand that, and to give him some credit, he was in the forefront of galvanising a response, and I don't think there can be any argument that the training that the UK forces gave the Ukrainian forces over many years and the munitions that have been provided, we've hardly been alone in that, I would say, but there's absolutely no question in my mind that is allowed. That is what prevented the Russians taking Kiev, and has held that invasion at bay to the extent it has. But The fundamental point in this for me is that Ukrainians are fighting a war to choose who gets to govern Ukraine. So I'm very clear the Ukrainians should decide who governs Ukraine, and we're fortunate to live in a democracy with all its flaws, and we've gone in some depth about some of those flaws earlier. But the people here get to choose who governs them, and of course, as you would expect me to say, and I think it's the people who've chosen to make their lives in Scotland who should ultimately be the arbiter of what Scotland's democratic future is and what the governments are that we have running us as well. So I can understand that sentiment in Ukraine, but I think that the international coalition is well established, and that resolve to support the people of Ukraine, to support their right to align themselves with who they wish and to be governed by whomsoever they wish, that is well established, and will transfer to whoever ends up as Prime Minister either now or into the future.
Okay, and well, just to underline that point, I was discussing with the team up in the office in the city centre just before you come on, Richard, and they pointed out to me a press release today from the White House on Johnson, and they're saying basically it doesn't matter who is in the job of PM in the UK, the policy will not change. West's NATO support for Ukraine is not going to alter one iota because there's a change in leadership in one country. So Ukraine will maybe have to get used to Ben Wallace. So let's move on to the next story then. We'll just have a quick look at this, really. I think this is maybe just tittle-tattle, and I don't suppose you care one way or the other who takes over. But the Conservative MP Ben Wallace, who's the Defence Minister, is the favourite among Tory members to replace Boris Johnson as party leader and therefore Prime Minister. The Defence Secretary beats all other contenders in YouGov polling of Conservative members. The pollster, YouGov, asked members of the Conservative Party who they would choose in various head-to-head scenarios. And in all scenarios, Mr Wallace wins by a significant margin. The former soldier, who's the MP for Wye and Preston North, has played a prominent role in UK's response to the war in Ukraine and also comes out top of the members' preferences overall by a lesser margin. The Tory rank-and-file members will ultimately decide on who becomes Prime Minister, but they only get to choose between the final two candidates after the field has been whittled down by the Conservatives in the House of Commons. This means that Mr Wallace may not, in fact, make the final two if he can't build enough support within the parliamentary party at Westminster. So when given a head-to-head scenario against Liz Truss, Mr Wallace wins by 48 to 29%. Against Penny Mordaunt, he wins by 48 to 26. Against Rishi Sunak by 51 to 30%. And against Jeremy Hunt by 58 to 22. So he's also ahead of other candidates such as Michael Gove, Dominic Raab, Tom Tugendhat, Nadine Zahawi, and Sajid Jawood all poll very low. This is on a Conservative members poll. As I said before, I don't know if I'm maybe being a bit dismissive of this, but maybe you're not all that bothered who do you get. But of course, the point I'm making is it's not up to us. It's not up to us in Scotland. In fact, it's not even up to most people in England who do you get as Prime Minister. It's up to a very small number of Conservatives, isn't it? Mainly in England.
Well, yeah, and isn't it odd? Isn't it strange that about 300 odd Tories get to drop the shortlist for the next Prime Minister of the UK at the same time as they're actively seeking to deny ways of 5.5 million Scots getting to choose their own future on whether or not they want to be independent. So I think, and also the fact that I was having a chuckle last night to one of my constituency neighbour to the south, Andrew Bowie, Tory MP in West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine, basically arguing last night before Boris Johnson announced his intention to resign, basically saying they needed another vote. And the number of people who piled in saying, goodness, Andrew, it's almost as if a material change in circumstances justifies revisiting an earlier democratic decision. So I don't think he'd properly thought that one through. But in terms of the runners and riders, I've been down doing a fair bit of TV and radio broadcast stuff today, given the SNP take on the situation in Westminster at the moment. And actually, there's the bookies are down there with whiteboards and offering odds on some of the contenders. Ben Wallace is clearly the bookies' favourite at the moment. My issue with that is, I remember Ben Wallace when he was a member of the Scottish Parliament for North East Scotland, and he wasn't a conspicuously popular member of that Parliament, and he wasn't conspicuously popular, as I recall, amongst his own side. And he's popped up in Westminster, and people take him seriously as a defence minister, which is well and good. He does have a background in military service, but I just wonder, when you nudge him away from talking about matters of defence and international security, just how sure-footed he really is on other matters like education or health or home affairs or anything like that. Because some viewers may remember he popped up on Spectator magazine TV when at a time when in the pandemic, when the military were giving help driving ambulances, and he wagged his finger and in his most stentorian tones said, patronised us for saying, the military is not there to sort out your public service failings in the devolved nations, and conveniently glossing over the fact that about 6 or 7 ambulance services in England were also receiving the same level of military help at the same time. So I think he's somebody who sometimes speaks before he thinks. That's always been my impression of him. And whether or not he's quite so sure-footed once you get him out of his policy comfort zone of defence and international relations, I think remains to be seen. But look, Penny Mordaunt's been working the Tory donor base for quite some time. She's been like a submarine below the surface. I'd take her efforts, if she was to follow through on leadership ambitions, I'd take that more seriously than I would Liz Truss, who I don't think has done herself any favours over the last few days. Nadhim Zahawi has, I think he's completely exploded himself by within the space of 24 hours, becoming Chancellor, then saying to the Prime Minister, you need to go because of the country, and then emerging that he'd been engaging the services of political consultants for quite some time to plot a leadership plan bid for himself to be leader of the Tories. So I think he's, you get the measure of his character over the last 24 hours, and it's not good. Personally, I don't have a hot tip for the Tory leadership, except to say this, that most of the Cabinet were there because of their conspicuous loyalty to Boris Johnson rather than because of any conspicuous ability. David Cameron basically came from nowhere. Now, I accept that was when the Conservatives were in opposition, but I think there's a number of junior ministers in that kind of second tier level who are pretty competent. They're pretty decent. They don't necessarily have the public profile or the slick media skills that you would kind of expect a potential Prime Minister to have. But there's one or two of them you can see it might turn out that they do in fact have the chops for it. So I would keep my eye on some of the lower profile Cabinet Ministers and also some of the junior ministers, because there are some junior ministers who have done the heavy lifting for their Cabinet bosses for a while, and they may just think that in a Cabinet that didn't exactly distinguish itself, which didn't wield the knife on Boris Johnson, even after it became clear that that was what was needed, I think that it may not be one of the obvious contenders that emerges, particularly given the demolition derby nature of how they draw up the shortlist. But also, once it goes out to the wider Tory membership, that is just going to be the Wild West. You've got all the infiltration of the remnants of UKIP, and even further to the right than that, I'm sorry to say. So it really is up for grabs, I think, and some of the early prices might look quite good, but I think Ben Wallace will be tested in that campaign. But I'm not persuaded that it's necessarily going to go. The job will necessarily go to any of the top runners and riders that have been touted so far.
One thing the Conservative Party can always do is produce a surprise. But before we move on to the next question, I have to go back to Brexit again on this one, because there's two reasons really. First of all, because really for the last 40 years, the Conservative Party has been trying to balance pro-Europe and Europe-sceptic wings, and now they're going to have to balance Remainers, former Remainers, with ardent Brexiteers. But it strikes me there might be a possibility to draw back here, to roll back from Boris Johnson's hard Brexit. There was a story today in Reuters suggesting that if Johnson goes, Brexit goes. That's probably putting it a bit strongly. but he is closely identified not only with getting Brexit done, as he says, but with getting it done in the most brutal way, in a way that just takes Britain out of the single market and which has really severely damaged the UK economy. So, is there a possibility that the new incumbent might be able to roll back from some of the more extreme sides of Brexit?
That's a great question. I think that the problems that have been caused by Brexit, particularly over Northern Ireland and the need to avoid a border on the island of Ireland, it's clear that that has come about because of the nature of the Brexit that's been chosen. And it's one that doesn't work for any part of the UK, certainly doesn't work for Scotland. And we see that in terms of our food and drink exports and the way that, even though there hasn't been a diminution of standards or quality, because we haven't signed up to adhere to EU standards, we're effectively treated as a third country, and you need to have all the checks and the export health certificates and all the extra burdensome paperwork and headwinds that go along with that. And it will only get worse once protocols are fully implemented and grace periods expire. Now, the only way to get rid of that border in Northern Ireland is either a united Ireland, and let's not get ahead of ourselves on that, or alternatively to respect what public opinion is on this at the moment, and particularly in terms of there is still a unionist majority in Northern Ireland, and that is not for Northern Ireland to get back in alignment with Great Britain. It's for Great Britain to get back in alignment with Northern Ireland on trade rules. And that basically means going back, getting pretty closely aligned with the EU single market and the customs union through things like pragmatic steps, even like introducing sanitary and getting a deal on sanitary and phytosanitary standards. Now, that is what some Tories used to dismissively call Brino or Brexit in name only. So, well, tough. I am playing the world's tiniest violin for them, frankly, on that, because this is what the problems around this were foreseeable, and they were foreseen, and they were told, and they blustered on regardless, and they put their human wrecking ball in the form of Boris Johnson in charge of it. Remember, it was said at the top of the programme, we'll get Brexit done, except for viewers in Northern Ireland. So I think that if they want their precious union, as they call it, in all parts, and don't want to leave any part of that union behind, then they need to bring GB in alignment in some way with Northern Ireland. Now, I think there's a pragmatic landing zone there between some of what the UK government has put in its previous command papers, and also what the European Union has set out through its Commissioner Maros Šefčovič. Now, Šefčovič does not have a mandate to deviate from the negotiating mandate that he's been given. Nevertheless, I think there might be room there, as I say, to find a landing zone. But trust is gone in Boris Johnson, and nobody is going to want to deal with him. Certainly not, because he's going to be out, and there's a danger that the Tories going to elect somebody even madder and less suitable, and who then tries to tear up any deal that they do with Boris Johnson. So I think I think that's the space that we're in at the moment. But there is an opportunity for a new leader to come in, and the danger will be to pander to the Tory party base and say, I will get Brexit done, I will sort the protocol, I will stick it to the Europeans, and, huzzah, and they're carried into Downing Street aloft on the shoulders of a grateful Tory multitude. That's the way you win the leadership. But it's, as we've seen from Theresa May and we've seen from Boris Johnson, it's the way that you get toughed out 2.5 years later. So I just wonder if there's a space for honesty, what the appetite is in the Tory party for honesty about some of this, and signing up to things like sanitary, phytosanitary deals, upholding food standards, however they have to dance around it, I don't much care. But that, and the opportunity of a new leader going in with a different approach might just generate sufficient goodwill to allow for those negotiations to take place, because we need a protocol over Northern Ireland. It doesn't need to be this protocol, but we need that kind of agreement. And but fundamentally, the closer we get back to alignment with the single market and the customs union, the less need there is for checks, the more relaxed the EU can be about the integrity of the single market. Frankly, the better for everybody in these islands that we're reducing those trade barriers, and also far better for an independent Scotland, because it will mean that the trade barriers as a member state of the European Union that we have with the UK will be lessened. Now, I don't think that it's insurmountable as it is. There are ways around that. We'll see papers from the Scottish Government setting out how that trade, that where those trade zones meet would work in practice. But I think that yeah, there is an opportunity for a way forward here with the right person, but I think that many will be tempted to take a shortcut to winning the hearts and minds of the Tory grassroots, and that might just end up in the same stalemate we've been stuck in for the last period.
As we've said before, yeah, it's a very small constituency that everybody else is waiting for to see how they decide. And I'm just going to quickly move over a couple of stories to finish off with, Richard. Just back to Scotland now. We hear today that the Scottish Government has appointed a new chief entrepreneur, and he is Mark Logan, who was one of the people who set up the Sky Scanner operation, extremely useful piece of IT which looks around different flight options to get you from A to B. Now that's Mark Logan who set that. He was one of the people who set up Sky Scanner. He's not in it now though, but he's been invited by the Scottish Government to take part in an economic strategy and to be a champion for entrepreneurship. Now his role is really all about building up the support for starting a new business throughout society. The Scottish Government hopes to get more people from different backgrounds to think about being an entrepreneur, to think about setting up their own business. Mark Logan said, "I'm looking forward to building on my position in the Scottish Government, working with Parliament and the business community to boost entrepreneurship across the economy." So a quick word on that then. Do you think, is that something that we're lagging behind on in Scotland, the number of business?
I think to some extent, I mean, it's a mixed picture across Scotland. The northeast of Scotland, that I represent, has one of the best startup rates of anywhere in Scotland, or anywhere else in the UK for that matter. But I think we're very good at coming up with ideas. We're very good at academic research. We're not nearly so good at the commercial spin out of that. And the danger is that, or well, not the danger, but what always seems to happen is you get a promising idea that commercially is viable, and a bigger entity comes in and snaps up the intellectual property and then goes and makes all the money, but also creates all the jobs somewhere else. And that's an age-old story in Scotland, and it's a cycle that we really do need to break. And there's no one simple solution to that, otherwise we'd have taken it. But having somebody who has set up a company like Skyscanner and who has taken a company from start-up to big. They have all sorts of experience and transferable learning, and to be able to harness them to share that expertise, not just with entrepreneurs, but also to work with government and the enterprise agencies and the universities. And I'm not setting out how I think what the role actually does. That's just what my thoughts about how a role like that might work. Having somebody willing to share that experience and expertise, I think, could be invaluable, because let's take an example of another small European country, Estonia. Now, in Estonia, they are very digitally enabled and switched on, have been for years. Partly that was through necessity, partly because they felt it was the best way to establish their state. And I could go on forever about Estonia and how they've gone about that digital revolution there. But the thing that they're very keen on is what they call their unicorns, which are their small startups that then go on to become very big. And I think one of the most famous of their unicorns is a company called Bolt. And Bolt do everything from delivering food to providing to operating taxis to renting electric scooters and things like that. You get the app on your phone, and they operate in a great many cities around Europe. They've got a great brand, they've got a great reputation, and it all started out of Estonia. And if the Estonians can do that sort of thing, there's a question, why aren't we doing that in Scotland? Where are our unicorns? Well, we've got a good startup, we've got good infrastructure. I think sometimes it's just the thought about getting people into the mindset that they too could be an entrepreneur, they too could commercialise their ideas. But also, I think we've got to look at some of the financial regulations and the framework that sits around that, because people don't want to necessarily put their homes on the line, to start up a business or risk their family's future. failure is a key component in eventually achieving success, but we're pretty hard on folk who end up bankrupt or who lose money, and not through dishonesty, but just simply because there was something about their idea or the commercial environment they were in just wasn't quite right, or their idea just wasn't right for the time. So I think we need to find a way to help people to fail better, but also to succeed. And
Yeah,
having
that's true.
that background from an entrepreneurial star like that, I think is it's very, very useful. And it's not one of the usual suspects either that we find in Scottish life. Sometimes I'm grateful for everybody's contribution to public life, but to see a new face get involved in something like that, I think is very, very healthy.
Yes, behind any success is liable to be a string of failures before you finally get it right, and we've got to understand that you're not always going to get a business started right first time, and there's only one way of knowing, which is to try it out, and work out what succeeds and what doesn't. Now, I'm just going to finish with one more story on the economy very quickly. Scotland has outperformed the rest of the UK in exports. According to Ivan McKee, the Trade Minister, Scotland has again outperformed the rest of the UK, with total exports up by 5.7%. This is March compared to the previous year. That's excluding oil and gas, while the UK is down by 2.8%. I'll just repeat that. Excluding oil and gas, Scottish exports year on year up by 5.7%, while the UK is down 2.8%. Ivan McKee says it's encouraging that most of our exported commodities showed strong performances, with chemicals increasing by £676 million, manufactures up by 215 million, and beverages up by 196 million. However, trade statistics continue to highlight the negative impact of Brexit on the economy, and to strengthen the case for Scotland to become an independent country. Our export growth plan is undoubtedly working to offset the barriers we face as a result of being taken out of the EU. And if it wasn't for the drag of Brexit, our exports would be soaring. So that's Ivan McKee. Just finishing on a bit of good news there, but you did say earlier on, of course, really Brexit is really a shame around the UK government. But so it's encouraging, isn't it, that Scotland's still managing to export in spite of the trade to Europe being more difficult.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the thing. I mean, we talk about barriers; they're not insurmountable, but it just makes things that little bit harder. You're just it's equivalent to trying to run a marathon wearing a pair of divers boots. Is how I would liken aspects of Brexit for us. But look, for trade in Scotland to be up, exports to be going up 5.7%, particularly in the context of an overall UK decline, and for those exports to be excluding oil and gas, which is obviously such a big part of certainly the northeast economy. I think these are fantastic figures. Of course, Scotland's also doing the best out of any part of the UK other than predictably London when it comes to attracting foreign and direct investment. So I think it shows two things. It shows we've got a strong, resilient, diverse economy. It shows the importance of continuing to diversify our economy and doing what we can on that front. It shows the importance of internationalising our economy so that we're not overly dependent on exports to any one market. And it also shows the growing importance of making sure that through independence we lose 27 other borders and find ways to mitigate and manage the access to what has always been a very, very easy and lucrative market for us in England. But we need, if we want to, nobody owes us a living, and if we want to continue to build our prosperity and earn our social democracy, then we're going to have to look outwards and look internationally. And these figures are a very encouraging sign that we're managing to do just that.
Yeah, so Scotland is an exporting economy. We export things and services, of course, like Skyscanner. We export fintech services. But that's probably one of the reasons why Scotland voted for the European Union back in the Brexit referendum, of course. Maybe many people in England don't realise that there are actually very strong, very important business links with the mainland of Europe. Richard, let's just finally thank you for joining us again tonight on what's been an extremely busy day doing the media rounds. And you've pointed out, of course, that if Brexit is not done, and Prime Minister Johnson's resignation is not done either. So there's going to be more developments on that, obviously, in the weeks ahead.
Get exit done.
Right, so thanks a lot for joining us again tonight. It's always fascinating to have you on to hear your insights, and tonight with the added bonus of some bookies tips. So I hope people were paying attention to those. So I hope we'll see you again, Richard. It's a pleasure to have you on the show again tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, while I'm thanking people, Can also thank our viewers and supporters for watching the programme, and the supporters in particular, of course, our channel going. And if you'd like to be one of us, please look at the link below. And we ask people to sign up if they can to £5 a month, and that means you become one of the team. Part of the team, of course, are my colleagues who are right now up in the centre of Glasgow, who are producing a show with us tonight. Now, I have been saying for a couple of weeks that if you ever fancy getting involved in Scottish media, and if you share our vision that Scotland needs media that's actually made here and done from our point of view and not filtered through the lens of the London media, then why don't you join us? Why don't you see if there's anything you can contribute? And since I've been saying that for a couple of weeks, actually, we've had a lot of people have been in touch. And some of those people are in the studio right now pushing the buttons, and we had other volunteers in the other day. So the team is growing, so that's great. So I hope that shortly we'll be able to, in fact, increase what we're putting out and doing a wider range of programmes. That's what we aim to do with your backing. With your backing, we'll continue. As you know, of course, and as I just said, we've got fascinating prospects ahead for Scotland. It's going to be a very interesting 18 months or so, and we want to be there covering it for you. Okay, I've talked enough for tonight. I won't keep you any longer. So this is Hugh Stewart signing off. I'm back at Scotland at 7 again tomorrow. See you later. Thanks.